Okay, now I am unmuted. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kacper Jarosz, and it's my pleasure to open today's webinar on Energy Market Surveillance 3, Supervisory Tools and Sanctioning. This is the third and last webinar this year of the series. I would like to greet everyone on behalf of the Secretariat. Greetings from Budapest. First of all, my role today is to welcome participants, to provide some housekeeping, to introduce ERRA to those of you who may not know us yet, and then I will hand over the floor. I will give the floor, hand over the microphone to our moderator today, Mr. Mariusz Sfora. First of all, as I mentioned to those of you who don't know us yet, we are the Energy Regulators Regional Association, and we focus on bringing together effective energy regulators with the necessary autonomy and authority to make positive change. And as such, we have been supporting the strengthening and improving the regulatory framework for more than 20 years now, almost 21 years. We currently have 48 members across 5 continents as presented in the map. Apart from providing for our members, we also provide the public activities, and these are, among others, trainings that we currently provide mostly online, but soon we will also move to the hybrid and in-class formats. More details on that will be published soon on our website. We also organize free webinars such as this one and the series on energy market surveillance. We provide also the insights on tariff database, on tariff determinants and tariff data provided by our members, by our regulatory members. We publish reports, benchmarks, and other interesting research. What I can recommend right now is our latest report on role and engagement in national climate action goals, already available on our website. Please tune in and explore our resources. For today's webinar, as usual, I would like to introduce you to the housekeeping. First of all, please note that this webinar is recorded partially, but most of it is recorded. All participants are muted for the duration of the webinar. In case of any questions to any of the speakers, please text them, write them in the chat window. In case your questions will remain unanswered, for example, due to any time constraints shifting in the agenda, we will make our best to address them via email after the event. In case also any technical questions, inquiries, problems, please contact us at our general mailbox. This is secretariat@erranet.org. As I wish you a pleasant and insightful webinar, I also want to thank the support that has been granted to us by the Hungarian Energy and Public Utility Regulatory Authority, which made this webinar available for the public. My 2 final slides are on the webinar's agenda. I will not elaborate on them in detail as this has been publicly available for some time now. What I would like to mention here is that we have a small adjustment in the agenda. That is the session at 2:10 p.m. And this is extended by one more speaker, Ms. Katie Walsh from Ferc. So instead of having 2 case studies from Ferc, we can have 1 case study, and the introductory presentation is extended by Mrs. Walsh's presentation. And by this, I would like to conclude this welcome, this short introduction, and I would like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Mariusz Sfora, our Strategic Advisory Board member, who has been with us for the 3 webinars, the third one being today. Mr. Sfora, welcome. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Kacper, for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody to the last 2021 Market Surveillance webinar. My name is Mariusz Svora. I'm a lawyer, and I have an honor to be a strategic advisor to ERRA. I have also great pleasure to be the moderator of today's webinar. During the first part of our meeting, we are going to talk about procedural tools and the sanctions used by the regulators to effectively enforce market manipulations. The second part, I'm sorry. Am I visible now? Yes.
Yes,
probably.
yes. Thank you very much
Okay.
for turning on the webcam.
So sorry for that. The second part, as in the case of previous webinars, will be dedicated to practical case studies. All these important and interesting issues will be presented by great experts from regulatory agencies, namely EU ACER, US Ferc, Ofgem, and PUC from Latvia. Regulators play, of course, a crucial role in market manipulations, the detection. So I'm really grateful to all of you for finding time to be with us today and share your practical knowledge and answer questions. On the other hand, having regulators from both sides of the Atlantic create unique opportunity for us to confront various experiences and approaches to market manipulations. I'm also happy that we have with us great and responsive audience, and I encourage all of you to use this unique opportunity and send questions to our today's speakers. As the first speaker, I'd like to announce Tomasz Byzantine, who is team leader of Surveillance Team 1 in Market Surveillance and Conduct Department at the European Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators. Thomas is definitely well placed to talk about market surveillance in the EU, as he's responsible for surveillance activities of EU wholesale energy markets spanning over 27 jurisdictions and over 80 trading venues. So, Thomas, the floor is yours now. Next presentations will be focused on the US law and practice of Ferc related to penalties and enforcement procedure. It's a great pleasure to have with us Matson, Jeremy Medovoy, and Katie Walsh, three distinguished speakers from Ferc. As the first speaker, I'd like to introduce Jay Matson. Jay has been a branch chief in the Office of Enforcement Division of Investigations at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission since 2015. In that role, Jay manages teams of lawyers and other professionals that investigate alleged instances of non-compliance with federal statutes, regulations, tariff provisions, and other FERC-related requirements. Jay is going to present us in brief the enforcement procedure at FERC. So, Jay, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mariusz. It's a pleasure to continue working with all of you at ERRA to describe some of the processes and cases that we've had in the United States. I just flew in yesterday from Dublin, so I'm not sure whether to say good afternoon or good morning. I'm sort of in both right now, so wherever you are, good afternoon or good morning. As Mariusz said, I'm going to talk to you very briefly for a few minutes about procedural issues related to enforcement. I will then hand off to Jeremy, who will talk about our penalty guidelines. We have a formulaic structure that we've put in place to help us determine what penalties should apply depending on the case. And then Katie's going to talk about some of the limitations to that. It's interesting how Tomas just finished up talking about some of the limitations in trying to sanction behavior that was sort of on the periphery of the markets. And I think Katie is going to hit on that same theme in terms of what we've experienced in the United States. So with that, let me share my screen. Can somebody let me know if that is coming up? Jeremy, give me a nod.
Yes, we can see the full screen. Thank you.
Excellent. Why don't I give the quick caveat that that we always do, and I will give it for all of the presenters today, including Danielle Mechling, who's going to talk to you about a case a little later on in the session. And that is that all of us are here speaking only on our own behalves. We are not speaking for the commission as a whole, the chairman, or any of the particular commissioners. So, so to the extent we get it wrong, and hopefully we don't, that's on us. So let me take a few minutes. I could spend a few hours talking to you about procedure that we have in place, but let me give you the overall theme is our procedure is designed to make sure that we get all of the relevant evidence when there is a violation, so that we can make the proper determination as to whether or not we should proceed towards implementing some sort of a penalty, or we should dismiss the case. And there are lots of cases that we start and take a look at the conduct, and once we gather the evidence, we determine that there is not a violation. Sometimes we determine that there might be a violation, but that we don't think we could prevail if we went forward. And so in those cases, we might close an investigation. So we really are trying to get to the truth of what happened, and implement an honest penalty depending on the factors that come into play. This slide gives you a very brief overview of the important milestones in our investigative process. I'm going to delve down into each of these in a little more depth. So I won't talk here about them, but get into the detail. The first step for us is where we receive an indication that a violation may have occurred. Here are some of the most significant resources for us. I'm going to focus on on the top two and then the bottom one. The top two is in our electric markets that are organized, and not all of the United States has an organized market. We may have talked about that in one of our previous sessions, but in the geographical regions that have organized markets, there is a requirement to have an independent market monitor. And those monitors are surveilling the markets to see if there's possible violations of the rules of the market and the other statutes and regulations that apply to market participants. So we are in constant communication with our market monitors, who are not part of FERC. They are their own entities, but we're constantly talking to them and getting information from them. We also get a lot of our information and leads on cases from other offices and divisions within the commission. And that includes in particular the Division of Analytics and Surveillance. They've been on some of the previous sessions, and I think have talked a little bit about their various structures that they have to also monitor the market. The last one that I want to mention briefly is the one down the bottom, and that's self-reports. It has been very important for the FERC to cultivate what they call a culture of compliance. And as part of that culture of compliance, they have highlighted the need for market participants themselves to self-report when they make a violation. We get roughly 150 to 180 self-reports during the year. A lot of those self-reports are relatively modest violations, and therefore we work with them to come into compliance without actually issuing a penalty. Once we have a case and it looks like there might be a violation, we quote unquote open the case, and that starts either with an initial inquiry where we may ask for some data from the company. We may also talk to them informally and try to decide whether or not it's worthy of an investigation. If it is, then we draft a memo that goes through our management so that we can get sign off to pursue the case. And we start with what we call a preliminary investigation, but we find if the subject of the investigation is not being particularly cooperative, then we will make it a formal investigation And the primary characteristic of that is it gives us subpoena authority, so that if we ask for information and the subject is not giving it to us, or a third party who might have some information is not giving it to us, we can go to court in order to force them to give us the information. Once the matter is open, then we go about trying to gather as much relevant evidence as we can. And there are three primary ways we go about doing this, but I'm going to focus on the first two because that's the overwhelming majority. One is what we call a data request, and that is a series of questions that we send in a written document where we ask for information. We may ask for them to produce documents. We may ask them questions that they respond to in a narrative form. We may ask them for admissions. On such and such a day, did your trader trade 50 shares of X? And we're hoping to get a yes or a no to that question. The other predominant way of gathering evidence is through witness testimony. And while we can do it informally and sometimes do it informally, the most important evidence we get is by having the witness meet with us in the pre-COVID times by coming into our building and sitting in front of a court reporter. We've been doing it the last year and a half virtually most of the time, where we ask a series of questions and the answers are provided to us under oath. And then we can take that testimony and bring it to the commission, and if we have to, eventually bring it to the courts to try and prove our case. One aspect of evidence that is very important is what is called exculpatory evidence. That would be evidence that's showing that the subject was not guilty of committing the violation. And that is, it's exculpatory evidence in the American system is rooted in criminal law and rooted in our Constitution. We are not a criminal, we are not a criminal agency. We are an administrative agency, or what might be called a civil agency. So the criminal requirements don't apply to us, but nonetheless, what the commission determined several years back was that we should follow to some degree the same requirement as in criminal cases, that if we find something that is exculpatory, that demonstrates that the subject did not commit the violation, we should turn that over to the subject to let them know. And they do not need to ask for it. That's evidence that we are obligated to turn over once we find it. Once we've gathered all of our evidence, we go to what most subjects would consider the first major milestone in the process of moving toward a penalty, which is preliminary findings. That's when our staff will sit down with the subject and describe for them what we think happened and why we think it's a violation, and give them some idea as to what we think the penalty might be. And the subject has an opportunity to respond to that. It is preliminary, so sometimes there is still more evidence that needs to be gathered, especially if the subject says something to us that we hadn't known before or was unexpected. But it's when the case finally starts to take some shape. After we've presented preliminary findings, we get to a point where we're willing to talk settlement. If the staff is convinced that a violation occurred, we go to the commission and get authorization to engage in settlement discussions. We cannot go and engage in settlement on our own. The way the system is structured is the commission has to authorize us to do that. So we go to the commission and make a request. This is done non-publicly. The commission says yes or no. They usually say yes, because we usually have a fairly compelling case once we get to that point. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking the commission for settlement authorization. And then we go to the subject and say, we have authority to settle. We'd like to settle. Would you like to settle? And some of them say no. And if that's the case, we wait a relatively modest period of time. My practice has been roughly 30 days. And if they say yes, then we engage in settlement discussions. And if we reach settlement, we put together what's called a stipulation and agreement. That lays out very, very briefly what the conduct was, that it was a violation, and how we're resolving that, what penalties are going to apply. And once the settlement is done, the stipulation and agreement is done, we give that to the commission, and the commission has to approve that or not approve that. I'm not aware of a case where the commission has not approved a settlement that we've wanted to make yet, but Jeremy can correct me on that during his session if I got that one wrong. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm getting old, so I don't always remember everything. If we do not settle and staff is convinced of its case, and the enforcement management agrees. We go forward with the issuance of what we call a 1B19 letter. It's 1B19 because that's the provision in our regulations. It's basically a 2-page letter that gives a warning to the subject that we are going to ask the commission to issue an order to show cause, which really is getting to the point of a penalty. The subject has an opportunity to respond again. They could respond to the preliminary findings. They get to respond again here to the 1B19 letter. And if they do it within 30 days, when we ask the commission for the order to show cause, we will include that 1B19 response with it for the commission to consider. We issued the 1B19 letter. We wait the 30 days for them to respond. Then we move forward where we send a comprehensive memorandum describing the conduct and the violation and the proposed penalty to the commission. If the commission agrees with staff that there could be a violation, not that there is a violation, but that there could be a violation, what they do is they issue an order to show cause. It's generally a relatively short order, and that says to the subject, we've received this recommendation from staff, and we want you to respond to the allegations of what you did and tell us your side of the story. And the subject has 30 days to respond to the order to show cause. Sometimes they ask for more time and they get it because often these are complex fact patterns that take some time to put together their defense. And then they provide that to the commission. And based on that, the commission then decides whether to issue an order assessing civil penalties. And with that, let me turn it over to Jeremy, who will talk about how we determine what the penalties might be.
Jeremy, can we stop for a moment, because we have a question which is directed to Jay, I believe. I have also one question related to your procedural tools, but let's start from that question from the audience. Are the market monitoring departments placed in the market operators or within the regulatory commissions?
I'm sorry, Mary, say that one more time. I didn't quite catch it.
So are the market monitoring departments placed in the market operators or within the regulatory commissions?
The market monitors are within the what we call the RTOs. They're the system operators and the overseers of the market. So they are not part of the regulatory structure. Having said that, if you ask certain market participants, they would tell you that they feel like they are part of the regulatory structure, but technically that is not the case. And I don't really feel that functionally that's the case either. They are their own independent entities. That said, as I mentioned, we do work very closely with them.
Thank you very much. And my question to you is that, well, I haven't seen amongst that fact gathering tools direct inspections. Do you practice or do you conduct such inspections, or you refer rather to witness testimonies when gathering evidence for a particular case?
I think overall we have a tendency to rely on the testimony that we receive from witnesses, and we may ask questions. I've had cases where I've asked questions about where traders, for example, sit relative to one another to try and explore in that instance, how they would communicate with each other. Because if we don't see any emails or instant messages between the traders, it's probably because they're just talking to each other on the trading floor. That said, we do on occasion use inspections, and it probably comes, and again, Jeremy and Katie can weigh in on this when they're talking if they have some other thoughts. I would say generally it comes into play less with the market violations, where really that's all paper transactions. It comes into the portion of our regulatory structure where we're talking about certificates that actual physical entities have to have. For example, if there's a dam problem on a river, and you might want to see what, how the breach of the dam occurred and whether that violated their license. Or I had a case involving a pipeline, like natural gas pipeline that was being constructed, in the drilling equipment broke, and they had to go into a wetlands in order to get the drilling equipment, which was a violation of their certificate. And a colleague and I went up and actually looked at the area where everything happened. So that can be very useful and does come into play, but not so much, I think, with the straight market violations, because those tend to be just informational and paper.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. So let's keep to Jeremy. Jeremy is a deputy director of Department of Investigations. Jeremy, let me introduce you to the audience. He also served as a branch chief in DOI. Jeremy oversees and conducts investigations into potential violations of the statutes, rules, and regulations administered by the Ferc. And Jeremy will present us now an overview of Ferc's penalty authority. So we are going to sanctions and penalization of abusive practices. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mariusz, and thank you all. I'm happy to be here. I see we've got like more than 80 participants. I think that's great. So I'm happy to talk about the Commission's Ferc's penalty authority. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Share, and then I'm going to now let me get it in the, can everyone see my, okay, we're good now. Okay, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about the Commission's penalty authority and how the Commission determines penalties. But before I get started, let me just give a little context of this, just because I'm going to be talking today everything about penalties, right? It's all about penalties. For context, the central mission of Ferc's enforcement program is compliance. We are there to ensure compliance. What Jay just talked about are processes. What I'm going to talk about, penalties. It's all about, our goal is to ensure compliance in the markets. So just wanted sort of that context, because I am talking so much just focusing on penalties, and penalties are one very important tool that we have to help ensure compliance. So moving on, these are the topics that I'm going to talk about, and let me just try to summarize for you. There's really two sort of broad things I'm going to be talking about. The first is Ferc's penalty authority under the applicable statutes. And then second is how the Commission over time has determined penalties within that statutory authority and the different ways it has done so, with a focus on the current way, the current method Ferc uses to determine penalties, and that's through its penalty guidelines. So that's an overview. That's generally what we'll be talking about. So let's start with the authority itself. Whenever we talk about the penalty authority, I think it's important to start with the statutes. Since 2005, the Ferc's penalty authority is $1 million per day per violation under the two principal statutes that the Commission administers, the Federal Power Act and the Natural Gas Act. Just a couple things about this authority. One is that it's adjusted each year for inflation. So currently, I believe it's approximately 1.3 million today. The other thing I want to note is when the Commission got this authority in 2005, it was a significant increase in its authority. Just to give you an idea, So under the Federal Power Act, there were two relevant parts. The first part of the Federal Power Act deals with hydroelectric, the hydroelectric industry. Violations under that part prior to 2005, the commission had authority of $11,000 per day per violation. And under Part 2 of the Federal Power Act, dealing with more market-related issues, the commission did not have penalty authority. Similarly, under the Natural Gas Act, the commission did not have penalty authority. So what spurred this significant increase in the authority? One of the main things that caused Congress to give the commission this authority was the Western electricity crisis in the early 2000s, where a number of market participants engaged in manipulative schemes. And so that's one of the big impetus for this increased authority. Now, in addition to the statutes giving the commission this authority, the statutes also describe two sort of general global factors that the commission is required to consider in determining penalties. And we'll talk more about these later, but they are the seriousness of the violation and the efforts to remedy the violation in a timely manner. There's one more thing I'll note is that in addition to penalties, the commission routinely also requires disgorgement of unjust profits for violations in addition to penalties. So now we've talked about the authority that the commission has. I like to think of that sort of as the outer bounds of what the commission could assess as penalties for violations of its rules. But then the question is, how within that authority does the commission determine what an appropriate penalty is? And the commission, since receiving this authority in 2005, the commission has used two main methods of determining penalties. And this sort of timeline lays that out. For the first approximately 5 years until 2010, the commission used a case-by-case approach. This, as we'll get more into detail later, generally looked at various factors and then the commission then had a lot of flexibilities based on those factors to set an appropriate penalty. In 2010, it moved from that case-by-case approach to a more formulaic approach, where specific inputs with specific weighted numbers get input into a formula to calculate a penalty range. And that's currently what the commission uses. Those are the commission's penalty guidelines. So let's now dive in and talk about each of those methods, starting with the method from 2005 to 2010, the method it used prior to adopting the penalty guidelines. As I said, this was a flexible approach. The commission issued a number of policy statements where it outlined several factors it would consider in determining an appropriate penalty. These factors involved both the nature, or to use a phrase from the statute, the seriousness of the violation, but also looked at the culpability of the organization. As examples, for the violation, one of the big factors was harm. What type of harm did the violation cause? Was the violation intentional or inadvertent? And then they also looked at sort of factors, not so much on the specific violation, but about the entity itself. Does this entity, for example, have a compliance history? Does it have previous violations that show that there's some sort of pattern of non-compliance? That's an example. So the commission then looked at all these factors and tried to set a reasonable, appropriate penalty. You may be asking the question, okay, well, I see these factors listed here, but how did it come to a number? And that's a good question. I'll tell you that in practice, oftentimes what happened was that these penalties ended up building off of one another. Let me give you an example. Let's say you had a market manipulation violation that say it caused $5 million in harm. Let's say the entity earned in unjust profits $2 million, and let's say it was intentional. Well, the commission might set as an appropriate penalty, let's just say $7 million. This is a hypothetical. Then say a year later, there is a similar type of violation, okay? But instead, numbers were a little bit smaller. Let's say it caused $3 million in harm. The company earned unjust profits of $1 million. It may have been intentional, but the evidence was not as strong. So you would compare those facts to the previous penalty and say maybe set it a little lower, say at 4 million. That's just an example, but it's to show how penalties were really and how we negotiated penalties at that time. They sort of built on each other. Now, that said, the question of how the numbers were set continued, and that was a question that many in industry, as well as at the commission, talked about and were concerned about. There was concern that the penalties were not transparent, or that entities did not have sufficient notice of what their conduct would yield in a penalty. And these types of questions prompted the commission to think about their case-by-case approach. And ultimately, in 2010, the commission adopted the penalty guidelines. Now, different from that flexible case-by-case approach, the guidelines are a formula where it actually addresses, I'm going to go back to the slide, these factors here listed here are actually, they are considered also within the guidelines, but they are considered with transparent and specific weights and credits that get plugged into a formula to calculate a penalty range. And we'll talk about how that works. We're going to go through the mechanics of an actual calculation. Now, so we'll get to the mechanics in just a minute, but let me just tell you a little bit about the applicability of the guidelines. One is they apply to all types of violations of the commission's statutes, regulations, rules, and orders. There are two exceptions, though. One is they apply to violations by organizations, not by individuals, and where there are multiple types of violations. As an example, and this does not come up too often, but just as an example, if you had a fact pattern where somehow you had market manipulation and then a totally separate type of violation, let's say one dealing with the reliability of the electric grid, that also you would not apply the guidelines. For those types of violations, you would use the case-by-case approach that we talked about earlier. One of the reasons is for the individuals, the penalty guidelines, the commission modeled after the US sentencing guidelines, which are used in federal cases for criminal cases. And the chapter that the commission used as a model for the penalty guidelines applied to organizations. And so the commission did not feel that it would be a good fit for individuals. One more point about the applicability, and that is that, I've described this formulaic approach, but the commission can depart from the penalty that the penalty guidelines generate. It does not routinely depart, but it can. And part of the reason for this is remember I described that the case-by-case approach allows for much more flexibility. Here, where you have a system where it's set, right? The guidelines account for certain factors and you plug different numbers into them. It's impossible when you have a system like that to account for all facts and circumstances that could arise in a case. And so the commission wanted to give itself that flexibility in case the guidelines really did not relate well to a specific fact pattern. So the commission can depart. It does not do so often, but it can. We're now going to go into, and I'll finish by talking about the mechanics just to show you how penalties are calculated under the guideline. This is a flow chart, but I'm going to go into each step. There are 5 basic steps. The first step is really the easiest step. You find what the base violation level is. And this is a given number. It's set by the guidelines. So as an example, you see this middle bullet here. If it's a fraud case or manipulation case, the base violation level is 6, and that's set. You plug 6 into the calculator. Now that's the base violation level. We're now going to calculate the general violation level by applying some adjustments that are in the guidelines to that base number. As an example, in the chapter of the guidelines on fraud violations, one of the adjustments is based on loss or market harm. How much harm did the violation cause? So as an example, let's say you had a violation that caused more than $2.5 million. Well, you look at this chart that's in the guidelines, and it says if you have more than $2.5 million, you add 18. Okay, so in that hypothetical, you would add 16 to the base of 6, and you're at 24. Let me just give you some examples of other adjustments. We have an adjustment in the guidelines for the duration. Generally, we consider the violation more serious if it lasted for 2 years as opposed to 1 month. We also have an adder for the volume of either natural gas or electricity involved in the violation. Now we'll move to step 3. And step 3 is where you calculate the base penalty. And the base penalty is one part of the equation in determining the ultimate penalty. How do you determine the base penalty? Well, if you look at the bottom of this slide, there is a table in the guidelines. And basically, you take the violation level that we just determined. Remember, based on the base and the adjustment for 2.5 million, we came up with a violation level of 24. And here you see that a 24 equates to $2.1 million. You're not quite done because the base penalty is the greater of that number, that 2.1 million, or the pecuniary gain to the organization, or the pecuniary loss. You now have the base penalty. So in this case, let's say it's 2.1 million. That's on one side, okay? That's one side of the equation. Now you go to step 4, and you're now going to calculate what's called the culpability score of the organization. This, if the base penalty is based more on the characteristics of the violation, the culpability score is based more on the entity itself. So for example, you start with a 5, and then you have these factors here that you either subtract or add to based on their applicability. As an example, an entity would get an adder if they have a prior history of violation. They would get a credit if, for example, they self-reported the violation. You come up with the number then of the culpability score. Let's just assume it is a 4. So a 4, looking at this table in the guidelines, equates to a minimum multiplier of 0.8 or a maximum multiplier of 1.6. You then take your base penalty, which remember was 2.1 million, and you multiply it by the minimum multiplier and the maximum multiplier, and that is your penalty range. That is the range, and it's generally the minimum number in the range is half. Generally speaking, it amounts to half of what the maximum number in the range is. And this provides the commission with some flexibility within that range to set the penalty. So that's how penalties today are determined at the commission. And that concludes my portion of presentation.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. there are no questions from the audience, but there is one thing that I'd like to highlight before we skip to another presentation. Well, you have very detailed rules for penalty calculation, leaving a very narrow margin of discretion when calculating fines, as far as I understand. I believe that this is a very good practice, which should be followed by regulators, as it gives a clear message to regulated entities about the policy of a regulator. I have one detailed question to you related to setting culpability score. What factors do you exactly take into account when assessing commitment to compliance of a regulated entity?
Okay, yeah, good question. And actually, this is, to me, one of the benefits of the penalty guidelines is that the penalty guidelines, so the penalty guidelines give up to a 3-point credit for an effective compliance program. But what the guidelines do is they describe what you need to have an effective compliance program. And there are many factors listed in the guidelines to see if you have, an effective compliance program. So these include, for example, some of the big ones are a robust training program for the staff at a trading firm, right? Where you have regular training. And when we conduct investigations, Jay talked, for example, about testimony or about document requests. We're going to ask to see their compliance programs. We're going to want to know about the training. We're going to want to know how regular the training is and what the training covers. Because it's one thing to just say we do training, but we want to see, is the training up to date? Are they following sort of the big types of cases at Ferc and making sure that their employees are complying with sort of the latest rules? So that's a big one, training. Having a compliance program and compliance sort of a budget toward the compliance program with the staff, that's an important one as well. Another factor we want to see what are the disciplinary actions taken if they find compliance violations? What sorts of audit programs do they have to determine whether violations are occurring? We at Ferc, we have an enforcement hotline where participants can call us if they suspect a potential violation. One thing we like to see too at companies is does the company themselves, some of them have a hotline program where employees can feel safe, giving a tip of a potential violation. So those are some of them, Mariusz, but the guidelines go into great detail and provide a lot of notice to industry on what it is that is an effective compliance program.
Thank you very much for your explanation, Jeremy. Now I'd like to introduce Katie Walsh. Katie has been a branch chief in the Office of Enforcement Division of Investigations at the Ferc since 2020, and at the Commission since 2016. You might be a little bit surprised because Katie will refer in her presentation mostly to non-manipulation cases. But her presentation is really important as it shows that formulaic approach to a guideline calculation of penalties doesn't work for every case. So, Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen.
Excuse me, if I can just interrupt while we are setting up the next presentation, because we have 2 or actually 3 more quite detailed questions in the chat box. Perhaps we could ask our Ferc speakers to answer them in writing in the chat if possible. That would allow us to move on with the presentations. Thank you very much.
Okay, is it showing correctly?
Yes, thank you very much. I confirm.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit, like Mariusz said, and thank you for introducing me, about some cases that we have that do not fit into the formulaic approach to the penalty guidelines that Jeremy talked about. And several of these cases are under the Natural Gas Act. The Natural Gas Act for us also covers market manipulation in the gas markets, but it covers some other things that I'll get into. Jay went through a whole process. These are cases where we did find violations. They're not the ones that he was referring to where there were, closed cases. So the PGs, as Jeremy talked about, they're really driven by a measurable loss, gain, or harm. And so these are the two charts that Jeremy put up that really focus on a dollar value. And you can imagine that in a market manipulation case, this is relatively easy to quantify. You have the disgorgement or the unjust profits, and then you have sort of the cascading market harms that would drive these penalty guideline calculations. But we have some other cases under the Natural Gas Act, and these are some of the Commission's responsibilities. We regulate pipeline construction, storage, gas storage construction, et cetera, the transportation of natural gas, the issuance of certificates of public convenience and necessity, which is a lot of what we're going to focus on in this presentation, which is basically the Commission authorization to construct or provide these natural gas services. There's also some sort of ancillary things like facility abandonment and the transportation under the Natural Gas Policy Act, which we won't get into too much detail on that. And then the construction and operation of pipeline facilities at the ports of entry in the United States. So these are just some of our responsibilities under the Natural Gas Act, and these cases that I'm going to talk about fall under these responsibilities. The first one I want to talk about is a case it's a hypothetical case that I'm going to talk about where there was an infraction with respect to the application to the Commission. So before you want to build a pipeline or open a natural gas storage facility, you have to ask the Commission for permission to do so. And you're going to apply for what's called a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. So the Commission begins on an exhaustive review of everything that you submit, and you're required to submit things like an environmental impact statement, which details, if you're going to build a pipeline, exactly where you're going to cross. Are you crossing any wetlands? Are you, anything like that? You have to have detailed maps, diagrams, how you're going to put this pipeline in the ground. You also have to let every landowner that may be impacted by this. Is your pipeline going to cross private land? And that's important because the Commission does have the authority, or the company has authority to take lands by eminent domain. So the Commission has to review all of this. And also if there's any Native American lands that are crossed, you have to engage in a consultation with the tribe on that. So the Commission really weighs the market benefits. Is this pipeline needed? Do we need to deliver gas to this certain point? That's sort of a market analysis that it goes into. And there's currently a lot of debate about what exactly the Commission should consider with respect to the Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity. And if you're interested in that, it's a lot about greenhouse gas emissions and whether or not that should be considered in the certificate process. So the case here that we're going to talk about involved a pipeline company that wanted to build a pipeline. So they filed an application and they came across a historic structure along the pipeline route that they wanted to, the pipeline to go right by this historic structure. So it identified this historic structure and said, hey, there's this historic property here. And what that does in the application process is triggers a consultation between Ferc, historic authorities from the state, and federal historic authorities. And then what the pipeline company hypothetically did was, while their application was pending, they purchased the property, this historical property, and then demolished it. And there's a requirement that you need to be forthright in your application. And so really the interesting question that this presents is, how do you quantify this violation? This is the destruction of a historical property. It's not disgorgement of unjust profits. So it just doesn't fit neatly into the formulaic approach to the penalty guidelines. The second case we're going to talk about, this is the Freeport case, which settled recently, and this was a construction violation. So in this case, Freeport this is their certificate of public convenience and necessity. They had this and they were to begin construction. The commission issued a certificate to build this LNG facility. And they authorized the use of 50 acres of land for the purpose of constructing this and putting this dredged material on this land. And so they were to clear this land, and the Freeport cleared 75 acres instead of 50. And I will note that that doesn't seem like a big deal. It probably would not have been that big of a deal if the company had reported it. But what happened is that a bird watcher, a concerned citizen, actually reported it to the company and said, hey, you're on land that you're not supposed to be on. So Freeport conducted an internal investigation. And then in their weekly report to the commission, they did not disclose that there was this non-compliance. And this went on for some time. So there really was a misrepresentation here in the construction process. So once again, we are in this realm of how do you quantify a misrepresentation and a clearing of an environmental harm here, where they went into lands that were unauthorized to go into. And then the final case I want to talk about is Tres Palacios. It's another case that settled recently, where the commission issued a certificate to convert salt dome caverns into natural gas storage caverns. And this is actually a picture of the Tres Palacios facility. They had their certificate, they built their caverns, but one of the conditions of the certificate was that they had to conduct sonar surveys every 5 years to maintain the integrity of the caverns. And as you might be able to predict, they did not do their sonar surveys. They didn't notify the commission. They didn't say anything like, hey, we don't have the money to do it. We need more time or anything like that. And another entity brought it to the commission's attention. And this was a violation of the terms of the order, which said you had to conduct sonar studies every 5 years. So once again, here now we have a safety violation. And how do you quantify the safety violation here? So, the point of this presentation is really to talk about these sort of 3 different kinds of harms that we're talking about: the demolition of a historical property, an environmental harm, and a safety harm that don't really fit into our formulaic penalty guidelines. And so it just sort of presents some challenges for staff and for the commission to figure out a way to calculate the harm here. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Katie, for this presentation. Well, a lesson I learned from your presentation is that the system of penalties regulators use shall be flexible, and it is hard to use these same measures in market manipulation cases and other cases, covering, for example, the environmental issues. So, in general, regulators should avoid one size fits all approach. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much for these presentations. Now we skip to Great Britain. Moment. And to the second part of the webinar, which will be focused on case studies. Well, and I'm particularly happy to introduce the next speaker, Nathan Mcqueeny, who is the head of market intelligence and oversight at Ofgem. Nathan and his team are responsible for promoting and protecting the integrity and transparency of wholesale electricity and gas markets in Great Britain. And Nathan will present us very interesting case related to balancing markets and in Great Britain. So Nathan, the floor is yours.
Nathan, can you hear us? Just checking if the connection is okay.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, unfortunately, the connection is not great. If you could please check if the background programs are closed. We cannot hear you very well. And there seems to be a delay on your webcam as well.
Okay, let me stop my video, see if that helps the audio at least.
Better right now.
Okay.
While we wait for Nathan to share his screen, I would like to thank very much to Jeremy for working hard there in the chat box and answering the questions. That's much appreciated, I believe, by the participants. And Nathan, please let us know. Okay, I can see.
Can you see that
now? Yes, thank you very much. If you could just switch maybe to full screen, because we can still see the top panel.
It's PDF, so I'm not sure.
If you go to view, I believe you can change it there.
Okay. Which one? No.
Yes, I think this is fine.
Okay. Okay.
From one of the participants, try Control L. Thank you very much for that. Let's see if it works. If not, maybe my colleague will help.
Is this any good or not? Not really.
Yeah, I suggest to continue as this is almost full screen. I believe if you just scroll through the slides, we will be able to follow without a problem. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I won't introduce myself again. So I'd like to today talk through a enforcement action which Ofgem took. This was the result was at the end of last year in relation to activities undertaken by EDF Energy thermal generation. This was behavior that we saw in the balancing mechanism. So just briefly try and provide some background and context, and then look a little bit actually at the behavior itself and the behavior that we saw. What we then did and what the outcome of the investigation has been. A real area of focus for Ofgem also is trying to see ways in which we can measure and look at market responses to to our investigatory action. That's something we spend some time trying to look at. So obviously we've got an audience from all over the world today. So what in terms of the specifics of the UK market and the balancing market. So I'm sure many of you already are aware of this, but balancing is a really important market, and this is where essentially where market design meets the actual physics of needing to keep demand and supply and balance and all of the parameters of doing that, frequency and all the rest of it, and reserves. And in the UK market design, we have have a system operator, somewhat like in the US, in places like PGM. It's part of the transmission system operator group, but it is a ring-fenced company that does the market balancing. They're called the ESO. And in the market design, up to an hour before gate closure or real time, then all market participants are choosing how they want to program to dispatch their plant, and they're trading in and around their positions. And then once you're through that gate closure, once you're within the hour, just as you're getting to real time, the electricity system operator takes over, and it uses what's called the balancing mechanism to do that. So it contracts with market participants to turn generation up or turn generation on if it isn't on the system. And likewise, where there are constraints in regions where there's too much power, it will turn it down. So obviously that's a complicated undertaking, and it's doing that in real time. And it's a legal obligation, it's a license obligation that if you're a generator, you have at all times to have and to be to submit to the ESO the cost of increasing and decreasing your output. So, as I said, the balancing mechanism is the primary tool which the system operator uses to keep the system in balance. It does our settlement windows are half an hour for a settlement period, and these get can be very expensive, particularly when generation and margins are tight. So just in terms of orders of magnitude, 600 million pounds in 2019, and we see prices have gone up as this year they've broken new ground. So we saw prices as high as almost £5,000 a megawatt hour, with the considerable strain that the markets are under at the moment. So it's a big marketplace. Now, when this case centered around what are called dynamic parameters, and one of those dynamic parameters is called SEL, which is the stable export limit. So for the system operator, when it's thinking about bringing the system into balance, it obviously cares about price. How much can I buy to bring megawatts on? But it also needs to look at what the kind of physical characteristics of the normally gas-fired power stations in the UK. We don't have much coal anymore. What are the characteristics of those plants? So specifically, how quickly can it ramp up? What's its maximum output? What's its minimum output? If I bring this thing on, how long must I run it for? Equally, if I turn it off, how long do I have to have it off for? And these are obviously really important variables for the system operator in how to kind of optimize the kind of system requirements alongside just like the actual offer price that they're given. And one of the features of the new kind of world, with lots and lots of renewables, non-programmable, lots of technical challenges on the system like inertia, is that often what the system operator doesn't just want megawatt hours, it doesn't just need energy, it needs things like upward reserve, things like inertia, and it has new, very significant challenges to do that sort of system balancing in the summer, for example, where there's low demand, high wind. So these posing very different sorts of system balancing challenges, and it means that it is leaning on the balancing mechanism to do a lot of reprogramming what plants are commercially choosing and how they're choosing to dispatch. One second. Okay. So what do the generators have to do? Well, their dynamic parameters have to reasonably reflect the expected true operating characteristics of the BM unit. And for GB and for other European Union partners, we have what are called Remit Regulations. These are the powers against market manipulation and insider trading. And one of those is to not required not to use deception, to use a deception to disseminate information which gives a false, misleading view signals into the supply of wholesale energy products. And in our view, if you are submitting as a generator dynamic parameters which don't reflect the true characteristics, that represents such a deception and is thus market manipulation. So really the distinction is that when you're submitting these station characteristics, that these basically need to be done by engineers at power station plants, not traders. So what was the what did we see? What happened with EDF? Can you still see that okay? Yeah. Okay, good. Is that working?
Not the whole slide. If you could just zoom out a little bit, please.
Sorry, everyone.
I think this is better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So EDF owned a CCGT, a combined cycle gas turbine power station, had 3 units at 1,000 to 332 megawatts, and it was making quite a lot of money in the balancing mechanism. As you can see, 70 million pounds in 2019, and our analysis showed that it was changing its cells frequently. So that was the context. What was some of the things that we were seeing? Well, this graph shows that the orange line is the amount of megawatts that the unit said that it could generate, the lowest amount that it could generate when it was already online. So say it was just running at its maximum, it was saying that it's, well then my minimum I can run it is 190 megawatts. And then the blue line is what we were noticing that they were submitting as their stable export limit when they weren't commercially dispatching, but they were looking to be bought on by the system operator in the balancing mechanism. And then you can see it jumps up to 250. And they wanted it at 250 because if the system operator brought them on and ran it at minimum load, it wants, obviously that's 60 additional megawatts at sometimes quite high costs. So this is what our analysis was picking up. Now for us, we believe that was causing consumer harm because it meant the system operator was having to pay for power it didn't need. And we can't, for confidentiality reasons, we can't go into this precise figure, but we think that at least led to overpayments to the company. So what was the enforcement action? Well, the outcome was that they paid a £6 million fine for penalty for sending the false information to National Grid. The company gave some good reasons why they thought what they were doing was actually helpful to the system, but ultimately accepted that it was market manipulation. And the other thing I think was just to talk to something that was mentioned previously is that we used a procedure where we have our formal enforcement processes, which sounds similar to some of the comments I was hearing from Ferc, colleagues mentioned, which includes the settlement and the contest procedure and ultimately the court. But what we can also do is we can circumvent that by a process called alternative action, where we can say to the company, on the basis of the evidence we've discovered, shall we come to an agreement in advance of that, but requiring admissions of responsibility, and that can save significant amount of investigation and legal resource, and also significant benefit of having findings in the public domain quicker, because the formal routes for enforcement obviously can take time. So we used this procedure called alternative action, and EDF engaged very constructively in that process, and as you can see, the result was the result. What do we do formally as a penalty procedure and as a penalty policy? Well, let's say that we're not going to go the alternative action route and we have the formal process of developing a penalty. Well, this is what we publish. It's very similar to the Financial Conduct Authority. And the first thing when we're deriving the penalty, the first thing we look at is we look at detriment. So did the company benefit? Is restitution to other parties possible? Did other parties suffer harm, and what that harm was? That's the first step. And then we look to on top of that sum, we say, well, what was the seriousness of the behavior? So there's a whole range of factors that we look at to assess seriousness. So, really getting into the nature and the impact of the breach, the deliberateness, whether it was reckless, the nature of the management oversight or otherwise. And then we, based on the level of seriousness, we apply a percentage penalty to what's called the relevant revenue. So this is the amount of revenue generated by a firm for a particular product line or business area that may be indicative of the harm or potential harm that a breach may cause. So as you can imagine, that's very large indeed. When you're looking at the kinds of money that large dispatchable generation fleets are making. So the upside and the kind of the level of penalty is very, very high. We had a nearly £40 million market manipulation finding last year. So that's how we then work in the level of seriousness, and that's where you can get some quite big numbers from when you're looking at relevant revenue. And then we adjust that with what we call aggravating and mitigating factors. So was the behavior that repeated, sort of systematic? How much company cooperation did we get? So we then make an adjustment to that number based on that. And then finally, we can make a check. We increase or decrease whether or not we think it may be too small potentially to provide the right deterrent signal. And then after all of that, there is, depending on the settlement window, i.e. how quickly the settlement terms are accepted, there's a discount to settle. So if you settle early, that's a 30% discount, and it goes 20, and then much later, and then later on 10. But that discount only applies to steps 2, 3, and 4. So in terms of the money that the company made that has to be returned, in terms of restitution issues, in terms of harm to other parties, all of that is not discounted. That's the first part. So what happened then after that? Well, we had concerns about this more widely, about the market behaving more widely. And since then, in March this year, we made another finding, again, of £6 million against ESB, Independent Generation. This is another CCGT owner in the UK. And not only was that in relation to this minimum amount of export, but also in relation to the time they said the plant needed to be on for. And of course, we continue to monitor the market for similar behaviour. We followed this up with an open letter to the market, which said some of the things that I've just been saying here, but also to really try to make absolutely clear that dynamic parameters were not kind of commercial variables that traders should be, submitting to try and maximize returns in the balancing mechanism. These should reflect the kind of fundamental characteristics of a power station in time. And just to kind of show that this graph here shows these are all of the on the left all of the CCGTs in the UK, and the colour is the number of times that we were seeing switching between two different cell types for when they were trying, depending on if they were trying to get paid to come onto the system. And as so this is West Burton B here. So there's lots and lots of switching in settlement periods, and you can see there was a lot of this behaviour potentially occurring. And then this point here, the red line coinciding with the open letter and the findings of the investigation, and you can really see that step change in sort of market-wide behaviour. Yeah, I think that was it for me. So yeah, happy to answer any questions. I may even risk my camera again if anyone has anything they'd like to ask. So we don't send. Thank Alexander. Yeah, we don't send trade and order data isn't sent to ACER, but we are we're close to finalising the kind of formal agreements about how we work together. So we already are, you know, obviously we know each other very well, but how we can share the data, how we can do the cooperation. So we don't send transaction data. We collect the GB transaction data, but we have a lot of necessary cooperation.
Mr. Sfora, are you still muted?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nathan. It's because of Brexit. I mean, how Brexit affects this relation between you and ACER.
So I mean, we're no longer in the European Union, so the legal obligations are different. I mean, like I say, they don't collect any plant fundamentals information. They don't collect orders to trade. They don't collect transactions. So they just that's different. That's something that Ofgem does now. But I mean, frankly, market integrity is not a zero-sum game, and there's just very significant, interest and incentives on both sides that we continue to do what's needed to cooperate to find market abuse. You know, we have lots of borders with European neighbours and interconnection with neighbours, and market abuse happens across markets. So I think whilst we're not legally sharing, whilst markets they're not legal, they're not collecting the information to kind of formally monitor what's happening in the UK anymore. I mean, there's just every interest from our side in cooperating really effectively with them. Yeah.
Good to hear that this cooperation happens.
Yeah.
Nathan, the lesson I learned from your presentation is that we should think about wider implications of a case and possible further improvements. You did that by sending that letter, setting out your expectations related to submissions of information in the balancing market by generators. But I have also one question to you. You have various powers in your procedural guidelines related to gathering evidence. In your opinion, which of these powers have proved to be most effective so far, or which ones you use more often than others in your enforcement?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's hard to say. I think being the obligation to retain communications is a very powerful obligation, I know that say colleagues who work in different areas of enforcement, like say on the competition side and elsewhere, in contrast, that is a, all of the voice recordings in arranging transactions, all of the emails, that's an extremely powerful or rich source of evidence. Equally, being able to interview under caution, that's a powerful tool. So I mean, those are just powerful tools. I mean, I think in relation to the my feelings are also, I know that some regulators who I've spoken to in the past, for example, a lot of the investigatory work is done by formal exchanges of letters, where you get kind of lawyers talking to each other a lot. And I think my sense is not to underestimate the value of having face-to-face meetings, and particularly when you're trying to drive something through and to make stuff happen more quickly and to really get to understand where the other side is and they understand where you are. So I would not just retreat into sending legal letters to progress an investigation. There's a lot of value in face-to-face kind of contact in my experience. And then the other one is it's like we're trying to see the specific case in the context of the wider market behavior. So really, you need a deterrence. I think that is a prerequisite for having the right kind of behavior. But then, can you combining your deterrence with other kind of tools at your disposal to get the market behavior you want, and what potential you have there. Sometimes I think there's only so much you can establish through actual findings of breach, because there's a lot that you can do that we wouldn't want to see as regulators. That's a lot of behaviors, and there's only so much you can indicate purely through findings. Just a question of bandwidth. So if you can get the sorts of behavior you want through other means, be that sending clarifications about exactly what the behavior that you want is. My experience has been that market participants quite like being told where the lines are, and to not leave stuff grey and to make it absolute with clear expectations. Then that also helps get the wider market behavioural change, as well as just dealing with the specific.
Nathan, I'm afraid we are losing you. Can you do something?
Specific company. Okay, maybe it's my video. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Not anymore, I'm afraid. Hello, Nathan. Can you hear us?
I don't know how well you can hear me.
I'm afraid the connection is not stable anymore. So I'm not sure if we can answer the last question that appeared in the chat box. Perhaps Nathan can also take it in writing, and that would allow us to move on with the session. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. We can hear you now. So maybe you can answer that last question related to your Remit system, and so Sergey asks whether you established your own ARIS-like surveillance system and keep making use of RRMs.
Yeah, so we have our own system. It's not ARIS, and we don't use RMs. We collect the information directly from brokerages and exchanges.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nathan. Thank you for joining us with that very interesting case. I must say I have studied your procedural guidelines, and having such guidelines, it is another good practice that we can recommend to all regulators. So thank you very much once more, Nathan, for joining us today. And
thank you. Good luck with your session.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Danielle Mechling. Danielle has been a staff attorney in the Office of Enforcement Division of Investigations at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission since 2016. In her current role, Danielle leads investigations into fraud and other potentially unlawful conduct in Ferc, jurisdictional markets. Danielle will present us a case that underlines the importance of constant evaluation. I believe that this is very important, especially in hard cases, where the regulator must be open for additional arguments and evidence provided by the parties. It's not easy sometimes for a regulator to take a step back, but I believe that especially self-confident and experienced regulators can do that without risking their air of authority. So that's all from me. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Mariusz. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen now. Let's see.
We can see it now.
Can you all see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. So I work at Ferc alongside Jay, Jeremy, and Katie, who presented earlier. And I'm going to present what we think is an interesting case study related to Footprint Power LLC Salem Harbor facility and offering behavior that we detected at that facility in 2013. So bear with me for a second. So the facts of this case are in themselves interesting, but it's also an interesting case study because as Mariusz alluded to before, it's also the first time enforcement has changed its recommendation to the commission to sanction an investigative subject after the commission has already issued or initiated a public enforcement proceeding against that subject. So this case related to our regulatory requirements for accuracy in energy and supply offers. And in it, a generating unit lacked fuel, yet continued to submit false energy supply offers that stated that the unit's full generating capacity was available to the market when it wasn't, while that unit was also simultaneously collecting millions of dollars in payments for energy supply that it knew it couldn't provide. Enforcement alleged that this conduct violated various market rules, including tariff rules and the requirement to report anticipated generator availability, which also includes the ability to procure fuel. We also found that it violated our market behavior rule regarding accurate and factual information and not submitting false or misleading information or omitting material information in any communication with a commission-approved regional system operator unless that resource owner exercised due diligence to prevent such occurrences from happening. So Footprint purchased this generating facility from Dominion in 2012 for the nominal amount of $1,000 and the assumption of all environmental liability and other legal obligations. Why would Footprint do this? It's because it had plans to demolish the facility and rebuild a new gas-fired facility in that same site. The facility that Footprint did purchase had 4 generating units, 2 of which were retired in 2011 when Dominion still owned the plant. But the 2 remaining units that were operating when Footprint purchased it were a coal-fired unit 3 and oil-fired unit 4. And this particular investigation involved unit 4, this oil-fired generator, which the type of fuel that it used the relevancy of it will become apparent as I go through the presentation. And as I said before, the conduct under investigation occurred in the summer of 2013 in our ISO New England regional market, where the facility is located. So ISO New England has something called a forward capacity market, which in which the ISO pays resources to provide capacity to the New England region, which is located right here, the big red arrow, in our northeastern region of the states. So the purpose of this auction, of this market, is to ensure that the region has sufficient capacity to maintain system reliability in the face of future load and reliability events. And during an annual auction, resources compete to obtain something called the capacity supply obligation, which is a commitment to supply a specific amount of megawatt capacity in exchange for a capacity payment 3 years into the future. And resources that win a capacity obligation, supply obligation, must offer their energy into the market at an amount that's equal to or greater than their capacity supply obligation. And they also must be available for commitment and dispatch unless excused by the ISO under very specific and limited circumstances. When Footprint acquired Salem Harbor in 2012, it sold almost all of the facility's fuel oil back to Dominion for $8 million. Footprint did purchase more fuel subsequent to that sale, but by late June of 2013, it had pretty much depleted all of its oil that was on site. Even though it depleted most of its oil, it still had, at that time and through all relevant periods under investigation, Unit 4 still had a capacity supply obligation equal to 437 megawatts. And so consistent with that obligation, again, Unit 4 had to offer all of its megawatts on a daily basis and also be available to produce that energy. For providing that supply, Footprint received during the months of June and July over $2 million in capacity supply obligations, so approximately $4.3 million during that period. ISO New England's internal market monitor flagged Unit 4's offering behavior to us in a July 2013 referral. They found that Unit 4 had offered that Footprint had offered Unit 4 at an amount equal to its capacity supply obligation as required by the tariff, but failed to produce energy at its capacity supply obligation level when it was actually dispatched by the ISO. The ISO concluded that this was because the Salem Harbor facility lacked oil. The referral also concluded that Unit 4, by offering Unit 4 in this manner, Footprint had misrepresented the unit's operating availability, possibly in violation of the tariff and the commission's rules that I talked about before, requiring resource owners to submit accurate, not false information, and also to offer their units in accordance with the tariff, with whatever tariff applies to the unit. So during the period of investigation, enforcement, it's found that for 5 days in June and 25 days in July, Salem Harbor didn't actually have any fuel, didn't have enough fuel to generate at its daily capacity supply obligation. The interesting thing about this particular case is that for this particular plant, oil could only be delivered to the facility by slow moving barges, which Footprint knew from experience could take 5 days or 10 days or even more to arrive once the fuel was actually ordered. So what this essentially means is that if oil was not already on site at the time Footprint was submitting these offers, Unit 4 couldn't possibly generate at its capacity supply obligation level. So essentially Footprint knew that Salem Harbor didn't have enough oil, that it would take several days for it to arrive, yet they continued to submit offers at Unit 4's capacity supply obligation level during the entire relevant period. So Footprint, in defense of its conduct, provided several defenses to enforcement. For the most part, we found that those defenses lacked merit. One of the defenses was that it had no economic motive to engage in this conduct because it had certain fixed expenses that were always going to be present irrespective of whether or not they were actually generating energy. Of course, that argument, it ignores the fact that oil itself costs money and that they were not purchasing it as they needed to in order to keep up with that capacity supply obligation. So the economic motive there was obvious to enforcement, at least, was trying to avoid paying for fuel oil for a facility that they plan to demolish, and that in their observation hadn't been dispatched by the ISO very frequently in the past. They also said that they had a good faith belief that Salem Harbor had enough fuel, and that there were certain environmental restrictions that limited Unit 4's availability. In particular, they said that there were certain NOx environmental restrictions on the facility, nitrogen oxide emission limitations on the facility. But the documentary evidence that we had shows that there are a long line of communications between the Salem Harbor plant staff and the ISO years before this conduct, I think, took place even, that undermined this defense. And the ISO made clear that this environmental limitation did not excuse them for the CSO, the capacity supply obligation that they had bid for. So they bid for the CSO, they were required to operate at that level. Footprint also argued that the commission excused the conduct at issue in 2 orders from the commission that came out in 2013 in New England Power Generators Association versus ISO New England Inc. And this argument was another one that we didn't buy into, but it's a really interesting one. So I'm going to talk very briefly about it. So Footprint alleged that the commission pointed to the fact that the commission had closed pending enforcement referrals from ISO New England's internal market monitor that were based solely on the alleged inability to procure natural gas. In those orders, the commission found that a demonstrated ability by a generator, as opposed to procure fuel, as opposed to an economic decision not to procure fuel, could legitimately affect whether a capacity resource is physically available under the tariff, and therefore that it may excuse non-performance under that resource's capacity supply obligation. So just to put that example, to provide more of a real life example of how that works in practice. In our day-ahead market, the regional system operator obviously makes decisions about which units to call on to run the next day based on economics, among other things. So for instance, let's say there's a generator with a capacity supply obligation that's not called in the day-ahead market, but is called upon in real time. Because of its supply obligation, it's still expected to be available, even if it just found out that it's called to run like maybe 4 hours into the future. If it doesn't have the fuel, it needs to run at that commitment. What the commission expects is that it needs to go out into the intraday market and attempt to procure that gas. If it can't, that's fine, that's beyond its control, but it at least needs to try. And if it tries, it's excused. This excuse obviously doesn't quite work out well for an oil-fired generator like Salem Harbor, because unlike these gas-fired generators, they knew that their fuel could only come by barge, which could take several days. So they knew that they wouldn't be able to go out into the spot market and acquire fuel for their facility if they ended up being called upon when they weren't expecting it. So for enforcement's view, this exception that was set forth in these orders doesn't apply to Footprint, because it knew that if it didn't have fuel at the time, for example, the day before it was submitting its capacity, its offers into the market, it knew it wasn't going to have fuel the next day, and it knew it wasn't going to be able to get fuel the next day. Let me go back for a second. So as I said, we thought that most of these arguments were without merit. The entity did, however, provide some additional information to enforcement that led us to narrow the set of violations that we ultimately ended up pursuing, that we decided to pursue. And therefore, in June of 2018, we still moved forward with this case, and the commission issued an order to show cause, initiating a public enforcement proceeding against Footprint, seeking $2 million in disgorgement of unearned capacity supply obligation payments and a $4.2 million penalty. 2 months later, Footprint submitted an answer to the commission's order that raised an argument regarding Unit 4 supply offers that Footprint had not fully raised in its prior written responses to enforcement allegations. In particular, Footprint argued that its startup time limited the number of hours it could operate in a day, and thus limited the amount of hours that the ISO could reasonably have thought it could run. This is a little different from previous arguments in that this one was suggesting that the ISO essentially had constructive notice that Unit 4 would only be able to run a certain amount of hours in any given day. According to Footprint, because of that startup argument, Salem Harbor actually did have enough fuel oil to operate for the hours that it was offering the unit for. Enforcement found that there was some merit in this particular position. And while it didn't apply to all of the alleged violations that enforcement was pursuing, it applied to enough of them where the scope of our investigation was so narrowed or became more limited that we reevaluated our position and recommended that the commission just simply vacate its order. Essentially, the violation days went from about 30 days to 5, or approximately 5, I believe, or a smaller amount where the commission, the enforcement thought that because of the limited scope of the remaining violations, the commission should vacate its order. And so this was the first time in commission's history that the commission had vacated in order to show cause. And what I think it demonstrates is that, commission's enforcement process works as it should. We don't put blinders on once we find a violation. If the subject continues to submit new and relevant information and facts to us that make us rethink a position that we previously took, that's something that's taken into account. And staff is always carefully scrutinizing its own findings based on that new information. And so, like I said, we think this is a useful case to highlight that we don't dig our heels in once we believe that violations have occurred, if there is more information that we are presented with that suggests otherwise. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Danielle. We have a very interesting question from the audience. Oyton asks whether that behavior constitutes a violation of bilateral CSO obligation rather than a violation under Ferc jurisdiction. From my side, I would ask you a kind of more general question. Would you be able to draw for us the borderline between pure civil law case and the case that is interesting for you, that falls under your jurisdiction?
I'm sorry, how long, could you repeat the question again? Is it the question that's in the comments, or is that a new question?
Yes, it is in the comments. Yes.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, that's a good question about the CSO obligation. I can speak for myself personally, again, not representing the commission, and say that for sure, I think it could be found to be something that would violate the actual capacity supply obligation requirement that was put on that unit. I'm trying to figure out how much I could say. I think that's the extent of which I can comment on that. Yes, that is one thing. That is one violation that could have that could have been present there. But in this particular matter, the violations that were pursued were of the tariff requirements and the commission's market behavior rule.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another technical question about how long did your proceeding lasted from A to Z, and how many officers did it involve?
So this matter started, that's a good question. It started before I joined the commission. I believe it started in maybe 2014. So by the time, from start to finish, I would say, I think it was approaching 5 years, which is our statute of limitations period. So I think approximately 4 or 5 years. The commission vacated this order, I think in 2018 is when this happened. So between 2014, I think in 2018 is when the investigation ended up, when this matter closed out.
Danielle, yes.
Sorry.
How many officers did it involve? I'm not
sure.
If you can answer this question, but.
No, I think I can. Within the office, I think if I understand it correctly, within the Division of Investigations, there were staff with, I believe, three to four attorneys, and then as well as about the same amount of analysts in our office, who are market analysts, who kind of surveil the market for us and help us with data issues and questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Danielle, for your very interesting presentation and all these answers you gave. I'd like to ask you to stay with us for a moment in case there are new questions that can be answered via chat window. And now, last but not least, I'd like to introduce Janis Negribs. Janis is the head of Market Monitoring Division at the Public Utilities Commission since in Latvia, of course, since 2019. In the focus of his teams are both electricity and gas markets and both wholesale and retail levels. It includes market surveillance on remit regulation requirements and national legislation. Janis will present us case related to breach of obligation to publish inside information. Janis, the floor is yours. Okay.
I hope you see the screen. I just lost my mic for a moment. Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. As I also see the clock and value your time very much, I will try to be short, focus only on the very important things, but already in advance some excuses if I get somewhere slower, because it's a challenge also to speak between native speakers. So my presentation will consist of three parts. The first part, I will give a very brief background about Latvia, so you understand where the case has taken place. Then I will focus on the case itself, and in the final slide, I will share how looks our penalty system. So about Latvia, very basic facts. Then Latvia is part of EU, so this means that we are also, for us also, the EU legislation or regulation is binding. So we are also sharing our data with ACER and also are working with Remit Regulation. If you look at our production, then we are a very green country, I would say. Almost half of our electricity generated is so-called green energy. We are consuming a little bit more than producing ourselves, so we are an importing country, and we are mainly importing from Nordic countries and Russia. And if looking in the market, then we have joined and are fully open for competition since 2015, and we are a part of a bigger Nord Pool market, which is a market which includes Nordic countries and also Central Europe countries. We have 41. We had at the end of 2020 41 supplier, so the competition is quite tough here. And it also means that the margins on pricing are really low as the competition is big. And if very short about our main challenges at the moment, then you might have heard that Europe is facing very big energy prices at the moment, and we are not exception. And well, just two figures. If on previous year the average price for December was 44.86 euros megawatt hour, then today the price was already 167 euros per megawatt hour. And we also have one big infrastructural challenge, which is as we and the other Baltic states are part of former USSR, then our systems historically also has been synchronized, and this is about to be changed. So we are going through projects to desynchronize from the USSR countries and former USSR countries and to synchronize with EU systems. So lots of investments and also probably lots of new services after this will be done. But no, the main focus, of course, on the case itself. So I'm going to speak about reaching the Remit article number 4. And for your information, the article number 4 speaks about the obligation to publish inside information. And in very short, what is inside information? It's basically information which is not published yet, so it's not publicly available. And if market participant sees that this information, if published, will have consequences, meaning that this information might be important for other market participants when doing their bidding, planning, and etc., then this information should be disclosed. And typically, what we see with this inside information, it is unavailabilities of both transmission system and also generation units. But it's typically, but also there might be different cases or different issues which might be seen as inside information, some plans for future and etc. This information, according to Remit, should be disclosed in effective and timely manner. And what those words stand for, basically it means that effective means that this information should be available for all market participants at the same time, and without any extra cost or any extra burden. And the timely manner means that this should be done as soon as the market participant having this inside information understands that this is inside information. And to make this process easier and understandable for everybody, then there are so-called transparency platforms where you can disclose this information. And basically all the main hubs, also the Nord Pool in our case, they do have their own urgent market message platforms where you can disclose this information, and all the market participants can access this information. And also, Acer provides in its homepage a list of those relevant transparency platforms which correspond to different criteria. Now, moving on, well, here you see 3 UMM message, urgent market messages. These will be the messages in which I will about which I will tell you in the next slide. So basically, you see that there was the initial message and then 2 update messages, and those ticks and the cross on the left means that the beginning was very promising and very good, but something went wrong with the last market message. So basically, what happened? We are speaking about Latvenergo, which is our former monopoly or former vertically integrated undertaking, and on the end of November 2019, for some reasons which I cannot disclose here, for some reasons. The electricity generation at one of its cogeneration plants stopped, and Latvenergo took this decision to give to consider it as a market as a inside information and took the decision to publish it for market. So there was a first market message, and of course, when publishing the first market message, it was not clear for them yet what are the reasons why this unit has stopped. They needed further investigation, and also they needed some time for a technical solution to find. It was not clear at that time when this unit will be back at the market. So they published the first UMM telling that there will be an update, which is a normal practice when you publish UMMs to update as new facts come in and as more precise information comes in. So they published the first UMM, then afterwards they published the second, and finally they published the third UMM. The problem with the third UMM was that first of all, it told us that there will be an update, but the update didn't follow, which is not that bad because the UMMs automatically are not active when the time mentioned as end time runs over. But what we found out looking at other information, that the time given in the UMM was different to the time when actually this generation unit was back to work mode and was synchronized to the network. So basically, this unit could start its operations earlier than it was mentioned in the last UMM. How you can detect this? Well, first of all, of course, you can, if you are in EU, you can compare your UMM message information with the ENSO-E platform, where you see the electricity fed into the network. If those generation units taken separately exceed 100 megawatt power, but this was not the case because those 138 megawatts were divided in two separate turbines. You can also compare the UMM information with information from transmission system operator, because transmission system operator sees everything that happens in the network in order to have the stability in network, and also before you can resynchronize this unit to the network, you have to coordinate with the TSO, and this was the case in our case, that we had we asked for some additional information from TSO. And you can also ask additional information and explanations from a market participant itself, which also was the case of us. Well, what was the problem, or why maybe what came out of the reasoning behind this market participant? Well, the market participant explained that when publishing the UMMs, it was very strongly focusing on the day-ahead market. As you might know, that there are at least three markets. It's day-ahead market, where the trade, the bids for trades are provided for auction in previous day. Then there's the intraday market, where there's a 15 minute bidding before the gate closure, and then there's a balancing market, which is running basically all the time. So they were focusing strongly on day ahead, and as they knew that there are no bids for day ahead until the next day, they didn't see that there should be problem with this with not updating this information. Well, we were looking more thoroughly, and we found out that there actually might be problem with intraday or balancing markets, because other market participants, knowing that or not knowing that this unit, if necessary, is back with the grid, they might have done their strategies differently. So yeah, if looking on the right side, then it was good that they did a decision on the inside information. After there was positive decision, they did according to the remit they published UMM. They also did some updates as there was high uncertainty in the very beginning, but the mistake was concentrating just on the head market, but forgetting about the other markets. If moving on, and then about the sanctioning system, well, according to our national laws, you can impose one of the three further mentioned penalties or combination of those penalties. You can impose an obligation to ensure conformity with the relevant requirements of the law within a specific time of period. Of course, afterwards, you have to prove that you have done this and the regulator is checking it. You can impose the penalty up to 10% from the net turnover of the previous financial year, but this cannot be less than 300 euros, or you can express a warning. In the previous case, we expressed a warning. But when it comes, if you decide on the penalty, when it comes on how do you estimate the actual percent of this penalty, there are also regulations of the Cabinet of Ministers. What considerations should regulator evaluate? And first of all, and there I see there's some similarities already with the example provided from the colleague from UK, that you have to look, has the market really been affected? And you also have to look, has this participant from this kind of action derived direct or indirect benefit for himself? And in case both of those criteria do not fulfill, this penalty cannot exceed 0.15% of this turnover. If it has affected the market, but it has no direct benefit for the market participant, then the penalty can be bigger, up to 1.5%. And if both criteria are met, then it might go to all 10%. Then you also look at the duration of the violation. If it's up to 1 year on the base which you calculated in the step, in the first step on the A and B criteria, you can add something. In the case it's below year, you can add nothing. In case the duration has been 1 till 5 years, you can add extra 0.5%, and in case it exceeds 5 years, you can add 1% more. And there are also some criteria when regulator might reduce, but it's not an obligation, it's up to the decision of the regulator, may reduce the penalty if, as example, the violation is discontinued as the first information or information inquiry from regulator is received by the market participant, if market participant has voluntarily eliminated the consequences before a regulator has taken this sanctioning decision, or it has or market participant has actively provided proofs on its own initiative, or reimbursed the losses for the person suffering. It looks quite, I would like to hope that it looks quite logically and quite easy, but in reality, of course, there are also some discussions for ourselves. As example, if you look at those duration of the violation, well, one of the examples might be that if this is as this sanctioning system works for a bigger framework, not only remit cases, but also all other cases, which might be, I don't know, retail cases, inappropriate tariff set or inappropriate tariff applied, or some problems with the system service. Then in the case of UMM, it was hard to say what is the duration of the violation, because the UMM, as you see, it's 1 or 3 messages, and if it exceeded 5 years, it already was a system, a bad system of this market participant. So there are also places for improvements in our side. So that's it from me. And if you have any questions, then please ask them.
Thank you, Janis. That was really interesting presentation. In fact, I have 2 questions to you. The first one is related to the system of fining. From what you said, do you think that there should be a kind of separate system, separate legal regulations related to finding market manipulations, different, for example, from to the system of finding related to violations in retail markets?
I think that well, on the one hand, it's good that there is one system and then there's a broad understanding on how those things happen. What I think would be, and that there are like some freedom for the regulator to decide, because the regulator, when investigating this case, of course, the regulator is and the market participant are the 2 persons which are in depth in the details of these things. So we have kind of get the best understanding, but for our own comfort, when we come with this decision, then I guess that it would be nice that we had our internal or external guidelines, maybe how to find this balance between retail, between remit and retail, or wholesale and retail. I guess that this can also be done through some guidelines, just to get some confidence that we are that also the market participant, not only we are comfortable, but also the market participant already in advance understands what might be the end if something is wrong here.
Referring to that regulations of your cabinet of ministers, is there a space to take into account, for example, compliance and compliance issues
well, then I have maybe a question. What do you mean with compliance issues? If you can.
I mean, having, for example, compliance program or compliance policy by a market participant can be taken into account. For example, in the case of US penalty guidelines. So my question is whether it's interesting for you, whether the entity has such a system, such a policy, such a compliance policy, or not.
I guess that well, first of all, of course, this market participant itself, it has different internal policies, and it has well, as far as I cannot comment in detail, but it has also policies on the remit issues and on wholesale issues. But it is important to mention that also, at least in case of Nord Pool, when you enter as a market participant in agreement with Nord Pool, there is also agreement and also some guidelines following this agreement that specify what are your requirements or obligations, and also with this agreement you already agree that you will work according to Remit regulation, and it also specifies some things on this information disclosure. So I would say that my answer is yes, that you have to have compliance, maybe if it's not set by regulation of Cabinet of Ministers, but you still have to have compliance to work with the serious exchange.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you also for joining us today. At the end of this last ERRA market surveillance webinar, let me thank once more all regulators involved, and especially US Ferc and you Acer, who are our partners, and also our sponsor, Hungarian Energy Regulatory Authority. I would like to thank all our distinguished speakers and the great audience. I believe that the body of knowledge required will help regulators better understand abusive practices and use their regulatory powers more effectively. I also believe that the webinars were attractive for market participants interested in the development of their compliance programs. I'm pretty sure that ERRA will continue its engagement in market surveillance issues in the future. Personally, thank you for your attention and hope to see you at future ERRA webinars. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sfora. What is there left to conclude with, I believe, is words of appreciation to you as the moderator and the initiator of this series of webinars. Thank you very much for your diligent moderation and energy and time spent to put these ideas and valuable areas and fields of market surveillance together in the agendas. I believe this has been very fruitful and valuable for both our members and also some of the market operators, utility representatives, all other people that have joined us from outside of the ERRA network. From my side, I would like to thank all participants for your attention on behalf of the Secretariat and ERRA Presidium. As mentioned before, the recording will be available soon. I believe we will set it up on our website tomorrow. The presentations are already there for your access, and this is also an invitation to stay tuned and to visit our website as we are developing the agendas for 2022. I believe we will have plenty of interesting content, webinars, publications, trainings. So please stay with us while we approach the end of 2021. And 2022, I believe, will be equally exciting as this year. Thank you very much. And this webinar is now concluded, but I can see Mr. Sfora unmuting, so there is one last remark following.
I just wanted to thank you, Kacper, and thank ERRA Secretariat for this opportunity to moderate this great series of webinars. So thank you very much, and hope to see you next year during the next edition.
Certainly. Thank you so much. Goodbye and stay safe.